Good evening. My name is Mark Peters, and I participated as much as the public could in all but one of the subcommittee meetings, and I have some comments tonight. I just want to be clear, the main reason that we're meeting tonight is kind of what I'll call the straw that broke the camel's back scenario. I am happy to hear from Chris that they're looking to move the white flag nights. That is a lot of the issue, and actually a lot of the topics that I'll be talking about tonight. We've got the Freedom House, 22-bed, halfway house, 850 detox a year, women's shelter, and you've got the men's shelter. The red triangle is 1/10 of a square mile. It's too small of an area to house all these services. And if you look at the county and in Chapel Hill, the little black triangle in the bottom part, the dark triangle, is all of these. You can see the distribution within Chapel Hill. So one of the points that you kind of look at here is when you do come up with guidelines, you should be able to see that those services, because of your guidelines, are evenly distributed throughout the county as things are done. They're not concentrated in one spot. And if you look at the affordable housing plan, you can see in there that one of the goals is to implement a community-wide fair share. And so I would recommend that you look at that document. Let's look at a scenario here. I think one of the things useful, if you've got guidelines or ordinance, that you kind of put it through its paces and you try to figure out how does that apply in a situation. So if you add here this orange area, maybe it's a men's housing first shelter, the facility that Chris is talking about. In the last meeting, you guys were talking about numbers of 500 or whatever. So let's say there's 100 men they want to put there. You know, the land is free. It's got to go somewhere. Looks like a great spot. Let's put it right there. So if we look at the factors, the fourth facility in 1/3 of a square mile, the guidelines, there's no restriction. Beside a park, the guidelines, there's no restriction. Adjacent to the neighborhoods, Vineyard Square right there, there's no restriction. If you were to increase the shelter size to 200 men or 300 men in the guidelines, there's no restriction. So if you look at expansion of existing facilities there, let's say you add 50 beds to the transitional housing, which is essentially a fifth facility in 1/3 of a square mile, there's no restriction. There's no restriction being 500 feet from a park or 115 feet from neighborhoods, no restrictions if you were to add additional men. If you were to move the soup kitchen there, the soup kitchen, a fifth facility instead of the other one I was talking about, fifth facility in 1/3 of a square mile, no restriction, and soup kitchen is not a defined service. And this is a concern with a lot of people if Carrboro were to reject their CUP process over there. Let's say you were to take that men's housing first shelter, drunken high men allowed, and you put it next to Sewell Elementary School. It's Carolina land is free, it's got to go somewhere, why don't we put it there? Well, there's no restriction of a wet shelter adjacent to a school in the guidelines. There's nothing to ensure that sex offenders have a place to stay. Again, no growth problems there, no challenges. Another thing that we haven't looked at is basically if you look at the area, the neighborhoods around MLK, on the right-hand side, the east side of MLK or above the park, you basically see you cross MLK at one of two different places, either up at Westminster or down at Homestead, and the kids go down there, they cross, and there's no route that doesn't go next to an at-risk facility, either a men's homeless shelter or a drug detox, large drug halfway house facility. So there's no consideration in the guidelines about how to look at this from a Parks and Rec point of view. And one thing I want to talk about on YouTube here, and I've got handouts I'll give you, and I can send you this in soft copy so that you can click on these. But I've pulled out a lot of the council members' comments and put it on there, and you can see where the discussion that they had was that if they had specificity, they didn't want that in the ordinance because they were worried it would constrain it. Now, granted, they could have a public finding. They could override the specificity, which, as you well know, they do in a lot of cases that come before you. But what they didn't say, give me a guideline and make it less specific. That's not what they said. And that's when thanks to Granicus, I was out of town last time, and I was able to listen to the recording of your last meeting, and there was a lot of discussion along those lines, and that concerns me. And now I'm going to get to what I'll call unanswered questions, and that is, where are sex offenders going to receive transitional housing services? Because they can't have it there. The discussion is, oh, you're safe. because you can't have sex offenders there. But the question is, where are they going to go for transitional services, and where are they going to go stay on the 200 white flag nights per year? Now, maybe Chris has a solution with the new thing, and hopefully that'll be codified that it won't take place there, except maybe, in state of emergency type situations, though there are school facilities open for that scenario. And so the question here is, should a facility with $500,000 in Chapel Hill approved funding and another over $500,000 in public funding, you'd be leaving these men out? And then we have a facility that's receiving public money, so should it require a public site search? That's something that we commented to the committee. We asked them to look at the whole public process. From a Chapel Hill point of view, there's a couple of aspects of this. One is the SUP, and I understand there's a lot of laws about how those are handled, but there's also the aspect of the lease and the fact that the town is leasing the land to IFC and many other facilities that might come in the future, the battered women's shelter that was being discussed, or some future white flag night facility. So the town attorney in the guidelines, in the comment for the June meeting said that funding and leasing allow the town to require any process or stipulations it wants. So you have a lot of flexibility there, and I'm asking you to look at that and not just look at the SUP and things. There's a lot of unwritten shelter siting rules. If we look at IFC's document, which is at the end of this, and I'll give you in the handout, they specifically stated they didn't want it downtown. That was not something that was discussed in the public and being publicly funded. I think that's something that should have been discussed. There's been a lot of pressure from downtown merchants and Kids Zoo. If you look at the downtown development that's going to be right around the existing shelter, you can see there's a lot of motivation to move it out of downtown and move it around to economic development. I'd like for this committee to look at, or this board to look at impacts. What are the impacts of the at-risk facilities? When I heard the discussion from last week, there was a discussion that larceny and ordinance violations basically have no impact. And that's how I interpreted the discussion. I think that needs to be assessed. What threshold of larceny becomes an impact? I don't think you can say it's no impact. And to put all those facilities together, given the Olson study and the fact that there is a correlation with distance, that could be a problem. So we need to look at carrying capacity, need to look at the existing crime situation in the neighborhood, and I've got this in the packet too that I'll give you. And on that note, I want to share with you, I was a little frustrated that when the short report came to you last time, it came without a lot of the materials the public had provided, a lot of the materials that the shelter subcommittee had looked at. You were being asked to make a decision, and yet the materials weren't yet available to you. And I'm glad that it's being made available to you now, but I think it should have been made available to you to begin with. I'd like for the decision-making to be fact-based, where you look at different criteria that you've decided to keep in or leave out. Tell us why you decided it that way. If you relied on certain studies, I'd like for you to tell us why. And the reason is, as John DeHart outlined, there were a number of things that were cherry-picked out of studies. That one article, which I have a quote in here at the bottom that was misquoted, I was uncomfortable with in the last meeting that new articles were being read. The links weren't provided for the public. I had to ask for them. And when we got to them, it turns out that there are errors in the way that they're represented. So I would like for us to be a little more open and public in that. If the police have weighed in on an opinion on crime, I'd like for that to be given in writing, or for the police to come here and tell us that in person with the ability to ask questions. I want to point out Olson crime study for Chapel Hill had errors in it. I asked Ms. Olson on repeated occasions to provide the geocoding data. I created a website called nccrime.us, and there are some statistics in here. I took the Chapel Hill police incident records and made them so you can see them on a map in neighborhoods and compared suburban neighborhoods. And Ms. Olson took all the addresses out of there and then ran geocoding where you try to put them on a map, and she had 13% errors from that. And if you look on here, you can see on the bottom right-hand side on NC Crime, there's clusters of incidents available there. But if you look up here, the red dot is actually the location of Freedom House. It's not a bubble of crime. And if you look below it where that little hook is in the little box, you don't see crime there. So where did that crime go? And if she has geocoding errors and she's saying that these neighborhoods don't have crime, and maybe it's because she's missing it. And I've asked her to produce her geocoding data or at least her errors for me, and she's refused to do that. I have a problem with relying on that if there's not that level of openness. Another problem in there, Chapel Hill Police Department was cited as the #1 location for sex crimes, sex offender crimes, and if you go on NC Crime, it's been like this since day one that it was published. We explain why the police was pulled out of that data, because a lot of times you have a minor who's a victim, and they basically report the police station address in the police report. So that's not really where the crime occurred, or at least I hope not, because we got a real serious issue if it is. IFC published a map during the subcommittee, perhaps at their request, and the map lists every single social service. A handicap home with 6 or less clients, a clinic with only daytime hours, the Ronald McDonald House, churches, a clinic with daytime hours. So this doesn't really represent the facilities that are at risk and have impact. So it's false in some sense for someone to rely on this and say, oh, we've got social services everywhere, and therefore a facility that has 52 beds plus wet shelter for clients 200 white flag nights a year has the same impact. That's just not valid. If you look at the impact in the police incident reports, you can see the number of incidents associated with each address. And granted, there may be a discussion about things that happen near there, but if you look at the women's shelter, there's really nothing nearby. Freedom House, we're talking about instances right there at their addresses, and you compare those with the others, it's pretty clear that the impacts are greater than some of the other facilities that are being listed on that map. I have recommendations. I'm cognizant of your time here. These are recommendations that we put forth during the process that we asked, I know many of us asked to be considered by the subcommittee. A public siting process where the town is leaser or funding approver. And we would like for you to propose standards as well as guidelines. The guidelines don't have any teeth. And we'd like you to consider similar uses to consider in proximity. This shelter guideline report just looks at shelters. It doesn't necessarily look at soup kitchens or drug detox and rehab, the large ones anyway. I'm not talking about the little ones. The public informations that were promised in a document on May 26th indicated that whether there were guidelines and or standards, that there was going to be these 2 public information sessions, and those were not held. I think based on particularly the comments that we had last week from the public, they didn't really understand exactly what you guys were doing. And so I was hoping that the public information session would lay that out. Most people won't have the stamina or the time to attend 6 shelter subcommittee meetings to keep up with it. So I was really looking forward to that information session to bring the public up to speed. We got neighborhood crime and other stuff. I'll let you guys look through that at your leisure. And I appreciate you giving me the time to go through this. Thank you.
I had one question. Mark?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you go back to the slide where you talked about sex offenders and 1,000 feet? I don't know if I missed.
Are you talking about my recommendations or like there were a couple of them?
No, it was one of the later
beginning
slides.
The later recommendations proximity.
Here, that one. So the bullet that says 1,000 feet from school.
The site should legally allow sex offenders to stay there. If it's a publicly funded site, we should cite it where we can help sex offenders in our community. We shouldn't be putting a transitional facility or a wet shelter or anything else where we exclude sex offenders. In some communities, I've seen articles that said that it's as high as 20% in those communities. So
at this point, North Carolina law, state law, prohibits housing sex offenders within 1,000 feet of daycare facilities and schools.
That's correct. I'm not suggesting that the sex offenders will stay in that transitional housing. I've expressed a concern in the past that IFC does not require ID. That's a separate issue. The issue I'm talking about is, I agree with you, we're not allowed to have sex offenders in there. So where are the sex offenders going to get services? Where are they going to go to get services? There's $1 million of public money going toward the proposed facility up here, and there's nowhere for the sex offenders to stay on white flag nights, and there's nowhere for the sex offenders to get transitional housing services.
Are we making comments on this?
I mean, I'll be happy to ask any questions if you guys have questions.
Why don't we hold that for our discussion?
Okay.
Unless you've got a question for Mark. Then we can comment on the specific things during the discussion. All right, thank you, Mark.
Oh, thank you.
And you do have handouts for us?
Yes, I do.
Yes, sir.